In this video, we briefly talk about ACES before discussing it at length later on in the rendering section of the course. Obviously, it's quite soon to talk about ACES as we progress through the course, but as I'll be using ACES workflow in some of the lessons, I just wanted to give you a quick introduction about what ACES is and how to set it up in Arnold properly. So ACES is a system of color spaces and color management solutions that, through a set of mathematical specifications and guidelines, allows for a fully encompassing color accurate workflow with seamless interchange of high quality images and textures regardless of source. That is a very loose definition of what ACES is, and it has certain advantages when you implement it in your CG rendering workflow, like a much wider and brighter and saturated ranges of color and lights can be used without having to deal with burnout highlights and inaccurate colors. Or simply put, it's very good at preserving highlights, shadows, and colors. Let's just leave it at this for now. I know you are probably more confused than when we started this video, but more detailed explanation will be given in the ACES lesson in the rendering section. Now, how to get this working in Arnold? First, you need to download OpenColor.io configuration from GitHub. Just Google OpenColor.io configs, and the first index should be what you need to get. Then when you are there, simply click on this download button and extract the downloaded archive somewhere safe on your storage. In there, you will find different versions of ACES, and we work with the latest one, which is 103. And now we need to tell Arnold we want to use ACES as our color management solution and give Arnold the path to this config.ocio file, which you can find within the ACES 103 folder. Now in the color manager tab within the render settings, change the color manager from built-in to OpenColor.io. Next, you need to define the config.ocio file in this config path. Change the sRGB color space to utility sRGB texture. And change the render color space to ACES CG. Now we need to make sure that we work with the proper color space in the IPR window as well. So in the IPR window, from the view menu and under toolbar, enable show color space list. And now from the color space list, change the color space to output sRGB. And the last thing we need to do is to make sure that our textures and HDRIs are properly interpreted to work with ACES. You basically have three types of textures, right? Textures that control your color inputs like your base color or specular color, textures that control the data inputs like specular roughness or bump input, and finally your HDRIs that you assign them to the environment for image-based lighting, for example. And for these three types of textures, you need to consider proper color spaces. So let's take this wood shader, for example. The base color of the texture is being controlled by this parquet texture, and as it is a color input, the color space needs to be utility sRGB texture. The second and the third texture control the specular roughness and bump inputs. The color space for them will be utility raw, as these are data inputs. And finally, let's take a look at this HDRI image that provides the image-based lighting within an Arnold sky. The color space for these types of textures will be utility linear sRGB. Now, if you have a scene with tons of textures that you want to quickly make their color spaces appropriate for ACES, you can utilize Arnold TX Manager. So let's open up TX Manager from the Arnold menu. And here you can see all the textures that we have in our scene, and we can adjust their color spaces easily here. You can see the textures that we just adjusted their color spaces at the start of the list. And I can select all the textures that I know are connected to color inputs in my shaders, right click on them and choose replace color space and change the color space to utility sRGB texture. Also, I'm going to select these two data inputs textures and set the color space to utility raw. And now all of our textures are properly interpreted to work with ACES. Now, if I start the IPR, we should be in proper ACES color space, way more accurate and way more adaptable. One of the limitations at the time being is that you cannot render ACES managed scenes with Cinema 4D's picture viewer, and we need to stick to IPR. So from now on, If I used ACES in a scene, just make sure you follow this tutorial with the proper adjustment in your settings to get the same result that you see in my renders. Especially the proper OCIO config file needs to be provided in the config path under your color manager settings. ACES will be discussed later on in much more detail, but this lesson was designed so you are able to follow along properly if I used ACES workflow in any of the future lessons, and I will see you in the next one.